So, um, if you think back to late September of 2014, there's this incredible scene in Hong Kong.
Oh, yeah. The Umbrella Revolution.
Exactly. The Chinese government deploys this massive wave of heavy riot police right into the absolute center of the financial district.
Right, which is just this glittering, ultra-modern hub of global commerce.
Yeah, it's hyperdense. And the police are armed with state-of-the-art crowd control technology.
Tear gas launchers, pepper spray, full tactical gear.
And then they're brought to a complete grinding standstill by tens of thousands of ordinary citizens holding just everyday rain umbrellas.
It's honestly one of the most striking visual contrasts of the 21st century.
It really is.
You have the mechanized, heavily funded apparatus of a superpower, right, meeting this absolute sea of flimsy nylon and aluminum.
Which is wild because those umbrellas were initially just brought out to shield protesters from the sun.
Yeah, exactly, the sweltering heat.
Yeah.
And they were hastily repurposed to block the sting of pepper spray.
But it became something so much bigger than that. Like, that image of the umbrella just became a global symbol overnight.
It did.
And that gets to the absolute core of what we are unpacking today. So welcome to this deep dive.
Thanks for having me. I mean, we've got a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. Today we have a fascinating mission for you listening. We're looking at a huge stack of research, historical analyses, and sociological studies.
Right. Trying to figure out how these really basic human tools, a smartphone, a shared sense of anger, or literally just an umbrella, can fundamentally shake global politics.
It's crazy to think about. We're examining a profound structural shift in how power actually operates.
Yeah, because for centuries, if you studied international relations, you studied the traditional Westphalian system.
Right, the idea that the world was just viewed purely as a collection of sovereign states.
Exactly. The only actors who truly mattered were heads of state, diplomats, and generals.
It was this highly formalized elite choreography, right? Negotiated over grand mahogany tables behind closed doors.
Yeah, exactly. The club where the entrance fee is a standing army and a massive GDP.
But looking at the source material detailing the last 2 decades, it seems like that mahogany table is actively being flipped over.
By people who were never even invited to the room in the first place.
Right. We are seeing this complete decentralization of geopolitical influence, the voices of ordinary people organizing in public squares or, online forums.
They aren't just domestic news stories anymore.
No, they're unpredictable, massive forces. They crash the diplomatic party and force the global community to react in real time.
They are actively bypassing traditional diplomacy. But to really grasp the mechanics of how we got here, we have to rewind a bit.
Right, because how does a local protest in a public square suddenly hold the power to sway international markets or trigger global proxy wars?
Well, we have to look at the structural environment that made this possible. The spark that lit the fuse was the end of the Cold War.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and the intense, unprecedented wave of globalization that followed immediately in its wake.
Okay, let's unpack this. The early 1990s, the Soviet Union dissolves. The Berlin Wall has fallen.
The geopolitical map of the world is just violently and rapidly redrawn.
Yeah, the source material notes that 15 new sovereign states were carved out of the collapse of the USSR alone.
Including the modern Russian Federation, right?
And the overarching mood of that era seemed to be this almost intoxicating global optimism.
Intoxicating is the perfect word for it. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama famously called it the end of history.
Right, because the threat of thermonuclear annihilation between two superpowers had seemingly just evaporated.
Exactly. And in its place was this renewed, almost utopian faith in international institutions.
Like the United Nations.
Yeah, the UN was suddenly viewed as a body that could actually manage global interdependencies through consensus and diplomacy.
Instead of just being paralyzed by the constant threat of a superpower veto.
Right. There was a genuine belief that the world was on this one-way, irreversible march toward liberal democracy and open market capitalism.
That unipolar moment where everyone thought the big existential arguments about how human beings should govern themselves were basically settled.
We just had to smooth out the edges, basically.
But that optimism crashes violently into reality, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. If we fast forward to 2008, the narrative completely fractures.
Yeah, the economist Amartya Sen famously described 2008 as a year of crises.
And reading through the sources, I mean, this wasn't just a bump in the road.
No, it was a catastrophic, cascading failure across systems that no one realized were so dangerously linked.
Sen's analysis of 2008 is really crucial for understanding the modern world. He isolated three distinct but interlocking crises that hit simultaneously.
Okay, so what was the first one?
First, there was a severe global food crisis. And this wasn't just, a minor fluctuation at the grocery store.
Right, it was way bigger than that.
Yeah, across the developing world, particularly in several African states, the cost of basic dietary staples skyrocketed.
To the point of being completely unaffordable for normal people.
Exactly. People were suddenly spending the majority of their daily income just to secure enough calories to survive.
And wait, let me jump in here, because the mechanics of that are vital. Why did food suddenly get so expensive?
Whoa.
Because it wasn't just a bad harvest, right? It was tied to the second crisis Sen mentions.
Right, the massive global spike in oil prices,
Yeah.
which is exactly the connection we need to make.
Because modern agriculture is heavily dependent on petroleum.
It requires fuel for tractors, fuel for
Hmm.
the massive global shipping networks that transport grain across oceans.
And petroleum-based chemical fertilizers.
Yeah, exactly. So when the price of oil spiked globally, the cost to produce and transport a single loaf of bread or a bag of rice spiked right along with it.
And that brings us to the third massive shock of 2008,
Hmm.
which is the devastating United States economic crash.
Triggered by the subprime mortgage collapse.
I want to pause here because, we all lived through the fallout of 2008, but the actual mechanical link between those events often gets lost in the jargon.
It really does.
How does a risky banking decision regarding a house in Nevada or Florida essentially infect the entire global financial system?
Well, it comes down to the financialization of the global economy,
Right.
which is a core pillar of globalization.
Okay, so how did that work?
American banks were writing mortgages to people who fundamentally could not afford them. These are the subprime loans.
Right.
But instead of keeping that risk on their own books, the banks bundled thousands of these bad mortgages together.
They chopped them up and sold them as highly rated investment packages to financial institutions all over the world.
Exactly. Pension funds in Norway, municipal banks in Germany, institutional investors in Asia.
They were all buying debt tied to American housing.
So they basically built a massive global house of cards. And when the American homeowner defaulted, the entire structure collapsed.
Wow. Because when the housing bubble burst, those global investments became instantly worthless.
And that triggered a global credit freeze. Banks stopped lending to businesses,
And when businesses can't get credit, they stop ordering raw materials.
which means they lay off workers.
Which perfectly illustrates the terrifying double-edged sword of globalization.
It really does.
We spent the 1990s celebrating how open markets and interconnected trade would lift everyone up.
But the flip side is that globalization eliminated the buffer zones that used to exist between nations.
Right. It turned the world into a single planetary nervous system.
If the global economy stubs its toe on Wall Street, a factory worker in Asia loses their job,
Which means demand for raw materials drops.
which eventually ruins the livelihood of a miner in sub-Saharan Africa.
And this brings us to the most dangerous new variable introduced in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's not just that the miner in sub-Saharan Africa feels the pain of a Wall Street crash, it's the awareness of it.
That is key. The source material emphasizes the communications revolution as the ultimate amplifier of these crises.
The proliferation of the cheap mobile phone.
We went from a world where news traveled slowly, where it was heavily filtered by local state media,
To a world where someone standing in a crowded market in Cairo or rural Kenya has a device in their pocket connecting them directly to global information networks.
It fundamentally altered the baseline for human stability, didn't it?
Oh, completely. Historically, economic hardship was often viewed locally.
Like if you were poor, you blamed the local harvest or the local lord.
Right, your immediate circumstances. But when a citizen can see in real time the massive wealth being accumulated in London or New York,
And simultaneously read a breaking news report explaining how a policy decision made in Washington, D.C. is the direct cause of their local currency collapsing.
the psychological threshold for enduring that hardship drops to zero.
That is a staggering shift in perspective. If everyone, everywhere, instantly knows when they are being actively disadvantaged by a massive invisible system,
A system they cannot vote on or control.
doesn't that essentially guarantee perpetual unrest?
It definitely creates a permanent vulnerability for any state that fails to deliver economic stability to its people.
Because when citizens realize their grievances are shared, not just by their neighbors, but by millions of people across their country,
The friction required to organize a mass movement just disappears.
you no longer need a printing press or a charismatic leader touring the country. to build a movement.
Right, a single viral video or a shared hashtag can mobilize tens of thousands of people in a matter of hours.
And that hyper-awareness, that new capability to bypass state media and organize instantly, sets the perfect stage for the first major waves of citizen uprisings we need to examine.
The color revolution.
Exactly. Let's move to Eastern Europe in the early 2000s and dissect what happened there.
So between roughly 2000 and 2005, a remarkable series of popular protests swept through several post-Soviet states.
Specifically Serbia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, and Ukraine.
And while the local dynamics varied, the common trigger across these nations was almost identical.
Overt, undeniable electoral fraud.
Yeah. These were nations that had the superficial trappings of democracy. They held elections.
But the entrenched rulers were caught blatantly attempting to falsify the results to maintain their grip on power.
The people were essentially told they had a voice and then watched the state blatantly stuff the ballot box.
It's so brazen. Let's focus on Ukraine's Orange Revolution, spanning late 2004 and early 2005, because the source material points to it as the archetypal example.
The setup is incredibly dramatic. You have a presidential election.
Right, the incumbent prime minister, Viktor Yanukovych, is deeply aligned with the old guard.
Heavy-handed authoritarian methods and closely tied to Russian interests.
And he is running against Viktor Yushchenko, who represented a pro-Western reformist platform.
The lead-up to the election was marred by severe media bias, extreme voter intimidation.
And perhaps most infamously, the near-fatal dioxin poisoning of Yushchenko himself.
Which left his face severely disfigured. It was this visceral, physical manifestation of the corruption at play.
When the runoff election happened, official state exit polls inexplicably declared Yanukovych the winner by a comfortable margin.
Completely contradicting independent polling that showed Yushchenko clearly ahead.
It was massive, systemic fraud. But instead of just shrugging and accepting that the system was rigged, the citizens deployed a masterclass in nonviolent resistance.
Hundreds of thousands of protesters flooded Maran Nezalezhnosti, or Independence Square, in the capital city of Kyiv.
They wore orange ribbons, scarves, and coats to show their solidarity. Hence, the Orange Revolution.
But I look at this and think, a lot of protests put 1 million people in a square for a weekend. They take some aerial photos, and then everyone goes back to work on Monday.
Right, and the regime just survives. So what made the Orange Revolution actually work?
Sustained strategic disruption. They didn't just march.
They set up massive tent cities in the freezing Ukrainian winter.
They physically occupied the space, making it impossible for the capital to function normally.
Furthermore, it wasn't just a gathering of angry citizens, right? It was coordinated with widespread, paralyzing labor strikes across the country.
Exactly. They systematically ground the economic and political apparatus of the country to a halt.
They essentially told the government, if you steal our vote, we turn off the country.
And they held the line until the Supreme Court of Ukraine annulled the fraudulent results and ordered a repeat runoff election.
Which Yushchenko won.
It was hailed globally as a stunning textbook validation of nonviolent regime change.
Citizens used mass mobilization, intense election monitoring by domestic and international observers,
And unwavering public demands for democratization to completely overturn a fraudulent system.
the voice of the people had physically dismantled a corrupt power structure.
It sounds like the ultimate triumph of civil society.
It does. But physics dictates that every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
And geopolitics is no different.
Right. Autocrats in neighboring countries weren't just sitting in their palaces watching Ukraine's ruling class get dismantled on live television and thinking, well, I guess democracy is inevitable.
What's fascinating here is they did quite the opposite. The color revolutions terrified entrenched leaders across the region.
It initiated a rapid, highly sophisticated arms race of political strategy.
Rulers in countries like Russia, Belarus, and Azerbaijan actively, forensically studied these democratic uprisings.
They didn't simply rely on the old playbook of rolling tanks into the square, which often backfires and draws international sanctions.
Instead, they developed a suite of preventative systemic strategies designed to neutralize the tools of mobilization before they could ever be deployed.
And the academic term for this, highlighted in our source material, is anti-color insurance.
Anti-color insurance.
It sounds like a policy you buy to protect your dictatorship.
Yeah, pretty much.
But wait, I'm stuck on how this actually operates in practice.
Okay, how so?
If I'm an autocrat wanting to maintain the illusion of a functioning state, I can't just outlaw people from standing in public square or talking to each other without completely tanking my own economy and looking like a tyrant globally.
Right, that would be too obvious.
How exactly do they surgically remove the threat of a color revolution without destroying the entire civic infrastructure?
They do it by attacking the invisible scaffolding of civil society.
The scaffolding.
Yeah, a protest like the Orange Revolution doesn't appear out of thin air. It requires independent media to report the fraud,
Non-governmental organizations to train election monitors.
and activist networks to coordinate logistics, like setting up tents and supplying food. Anti-color insurance targets that specific scaffolding.
So they cut off the oxygen supply before the fire can even start.
Exactly. These regimes began passing highly restrictive laws targeting independent civil society groups.
The most notorious of these is the Foreign Agent Law.
Governments started labeling any domestic NGO, journalist, or human rights activist that received even $1 of funding from an international source as a foreign agent.
Which is a brilliant, entirely cynical piece of branding.
It really is.
Because you aren't outlawing democracy or free speech. You are claiming you are protecting the nation from foreign espionage.
It culturally poisons the activists in the eyes of their own fellow citizens.
It frames legitimate domestic demands for reform as subversive elements working for Western intelligence agencies.
Furthermore, these regimes tightly restricted how organizations could receive funding.
They heavily managed the state media narrative to portray the very concept of a color revolution as a chaotic alien virus designed to destroy their national culture.
And preemptively arrested potential opposition leaders on fabricated, non-political charges like tax evasion.
It really is like a virus mutating to resist a newly developed vaccine.
That's a great way to put it.
The citizens developed this incredibly effective, peaceful strategy for democratic protest. In response, the authoritarian immune system adapts.
Rewriting the legal and cultural code of the country to make that exact strategy illegal and toxic.
So I have to ask the grim question here.
Go ahead.
If autocrats can just endlessly rewrite the rules to make the precursors to protesting illegal, does the strategy of peaceful democratic protest have a shelf life? Have the autocrats already won the arms race?
That is the existential question facing modern civil society advocates. Peaceful mass protest fundamentally relies on the existence of civic space.
The physical and legal ability to gather, to communicate freely, and to organize without immediate state violence.
Right. And when regimes effectively implement anti-color insurance, they suffocate that space.
It doesn't mean protests are impossible, but it forces citizens to constantly innovate.
They have to find new, increasingly decentralized, and often riskier ways to organize that can somehow bypass these sophisticated state-imposed filters.
Which brings us perfectly to our next focal point. While the color revolutions were largely reacting to this very overt post-Soviet style of electoral fraud, it wasn't long before we saw massive citizen mobilization applied to a much more subtle, deeply economic context.
We are shifting from the post-Soviet sphere to one of the most hyper-capitalist, ultra-modern financial hubs on the planet.
Let's return to the scene we opened with, Hong Kong and the 2014 Umbrella Revolution.
The context of Hong Kong is deeply rooted in both its unique colonial history and its extreme economic reality.
Hong Kong was a British colony until 1997, when sovereignty was handed back to China.
And this handover was governed by a profound, legally binding principle known as one country, two systems.
Right. The idea being that while Hong Kong was part of China, it would get to keep its capitalist economy, its independent legal system.
And a high degree of political autonomy for 50 years.
Included in that was the promise of eventual universal suffrage, meaning the citizens of Hong Kong would eventually get to directly elect their own chief executive, basically their mayor or governor.
But as we approached 2014, the Chinese central government began aggressively walking back those promises of open democracy.
They issued a ruling stating that while Hong Kong citizens could technically vote for the chief executive, they would only be allowed to choose from a list of candidates that had been pre-screened and approved by a pro-Beijing committee. It's the illusion of a choice. You can vote for whoever you want as long as it's one of the 3 people we already picked for you.
Exactly. But what the source material highlights so clearly is that this political friction wasn't happening in a vacuum.
No, it was occurring in a pressure cooker of extreme economic anxiety.
This is the critical intersection we must analyze. Hong Kong had, and still has, some of the highest levels of wealth and income inequality in the entire world.
You have a hyper-concentrated class of billionaires living in luxury.
Coexisting in a city where hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens are crammed into what are known as cage homes.
Or subdivided apartments the size of parking space, paying astronomical rent.
So you have a young, educated population that feels entirely squeezed economically.
They look at their future and realize they will likely never afford a home, they are working exhausting hours, and the system is structurally rigged to favor a tiny elite.
And then the central government in Beijing tells them, by the way, you also won't have any political voice to try and change this economic reality.
It acted as a massive catalyst.
When economic disenfranchisement collides with the sudden removal of political hope, you get the umbrella revolution.
Also known initially as Occupy Central with Love and Peace.
In September 2014, tens of thousands of students and citizens occupied major intersections in the heart of Hong Kong's financial and government districts.
And we described the visceral imagery of this earlier. Up to 200,000 protesters eventually involved, facing down riot police with tear gas, using ordinary umbrellas for defense.
The logistical reality of trying to maintain a physical occupation in a city as dense and fast-paced as Hong Kong is just staggering.
They built supply chains for water and first aid. They set up study areas for students. They created art.
It was a highly organized display of civil disobedience. But we have to look objectively at the outcome.
Right. Despite the global media attention, despite the sheer bravery and organizational brilliance of the protesters, the movement eventually dissipated.
Because the Chinese government and the local Hong Kong authorities essentially deployed a strategy of attrition.
It didn't roll in the tanks like Tiananmen Square.
No, they absolutely refused to negotiate. They refused to make a single concession regarding the electoral process, and they just waited.
They waited until the physical exhaustion of the protesters, combined with the growing frustration of other citizens whose daily commutes and businesses were disrupted, caused the physical occupation to fracture.
And eventually it was cleared by police after 79 days.
Which highlights a very hard, pragmatic truth about civil disobedience.
An entrenched, powerful government that does not rely on the immediate consent of the occupied population and possesses the resources to simply weather the economic disruption can simply refuse to engage.
The other side of that coin, though, is the lingering impact.
Right.
If I look purely at the legislation, the 2014 protests failed. They wanted open elections, they didn't get to, the camps were cleared.
Yep.
If a protest ends without a single law changing, isn't it by definition a failure?
If you measure success purely in immediate legislative milestones, yes. But sociologists and historians view the umbrella revolution very differently.
Oh, so?
The source material emphasizes that 2014 fundamentally altered the political consciousness of an entire generation of Hong Kong citizens.
It was an ideological awakening.
Exactly. During those 79 days, they built incredibly dense networks of activists.
They learned complex logistics of mass mobilization.
They learned how to use secure messaging apps to coordinate without centralized leadership.
Most importantly, the illusion of a benevolent regime was shattered for many citizens.
The physical occupation of the streets ended, but the psychological shift was permanent.
It laid the exact vital groundwork for the massive, million-strong and far more intense anti-extradition bill protest that would erupt 5 years later in 2019.
So it wasn't the final curtain, it was just the brutal first act of a much longer historical play.
And what is fascinating is that this profound anger over extreme wealth inequality and the feeling that traditional politics was rigged wasn't just happening in regions facing authoritarian pressure like Hong Kong.
No, not at all. Around this exact same time, the West was facing its own profound, uncomfortable reckoning.
We're voices of the people were getting incredibly loud right in the heart of established liberal democracies. We have to dive into the Occupy movement.
Yes, moving from the dense streets of Hong Kong to the concrete of Zuccotti Park in New York City, September 2011.
To understand Occupy Wall Street, we must explicitly connect it back to the first segment of our discussion, the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis.
The economic reality outlined in the text for the United States at this time is just staggering, and we need to let the numbers sink in.
By 2011, the top 1% of earners in America held 21% of the total national income.
To put that in perspective, the source notes that in the 1970s, that number was only 10%.
So the concentration of wealth at the very top had effectively doubled in a few decades.
While simultaneously, the middle and lower classes were experiencing catastrophic losses.
During the subprime mortgage collapse, an estimated 2 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure.
2 million families evicted.
And the visceral anger of Occupy wasn't just that the crash happened, it was how the government responded to it.
The government utilized hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars to bail out the very financial institutions and banks whose reckless behavior caused the crash in the first place,
Deeming them too big to fail.
while simultaneously implementing austerity measures.
In many Western democracies post-2008, the state response to the economic contraction was to cut funding for public services, schools, healthcare, and infrastructure.
It is the ultimate systemic injustice. The perception, which was heavily backed by the reality on the ground, was that the government was socializing the risks of the ultra-wealthy,
Bailing them out with public money.
while aggressively privatizing the losses for the poor and middle class, telling them they just had to tighten their belts.
Occupy Wall Street emerged as a deeply diffuse, diverse, and physical reaction to that specific reality.
And what makes Occupy so unique as a political phenomenon is its deliberate rejection of traditional democratic tools.
This is what I find so fascinating.
Yeah.
Usually, if a group of citizens is angry about a policy, they form a political action committee, they fundraise, they hire lobbyists.
They draft legislation or they try to elect a new senator.
Occupy explicitly refused to do any of that.
Hmm.
They literally just brought sleeping bags and tents and occupied a small privately owned park in the financial district of Manhattan.
They rejected hierarchical leadership entirely. There were no official spokespeople, no presidents of the movement.
They utilized consensus-based general assemblies to make decisions.
Because they were legally prohibited from using amplified sound systems like megaphones in the park, they famously utilized the human microphone.
Oh, right, where a speaker would say a short phrase and the crowd surrounding them would chant it back in unison so the people further back could hear.
Which is an incredible metaphor for the movement itself, literally amplifying the voice of the individual through the collective.
But this structure, or lack thereof, is also where Occupy faced its fiercest criticism.
Pundits and politicians constantly went on television asking, what are their demands? What specific bill do they want passed?
And Occupy essentially refused to provide a traditional bulleted list of legislative demands.
Critics argued this made the movement useless. But the source material explicitly counters that by outlining 4 core philosophical values that drove the movement.
Even if they weren't drafted into a congressional bill, those values were solidarity, diversity, equity, and control.
Let's unpack what those actually mean in a practical sense, rather than just treating them as buzzwords.
Right.
Solidarity was the argument that society's institutions should be designed to maximize mutual benefit and human well-being, rather than being legally obligated solely to maximize shareholder profit regardless of the social cost.
Diversity meant embracing localized, varied solutions to pressing problems, actively rejecting a one-size-fits-all corporate globalization model.
Equity focused heavily on fairness, not just equal opportunity, but fairness in the distribution of wealth.
Pushing back against the reality where the 1% hoards the vast majority of economic gains while worker wages remain stagnant.
And finally, control. This was about self-management, autonomy, and the idea that an individual should have meaningful agency over their own economic destiny,
rather than being a disposable cog in a multinational corporate machine.
These 4 values resonated profoundly on a global scale.
The imagery of Zuccotti Park sparked hundreds of similar occupations in cities worldwide, from London to Madrid to Tokyo.
People everywhere recognize the same structural inequalities in their own nations.
But I look at that and think, here is the fatal paradox of the leaderless movement. It generates incredible viral energy and media attention.
But because they explicitly rejected traditional leadership structures, and because they refused to translate that public anger into a central, actionable political party or a specific set of policy demands, the energy had nowhere to go.
Without a pathway to legislate, the physical camps were eventually cleared out by coordinated police action, the winter set in, and the movement physically splintered.
It is the ultimate vulnerability of decentralization. You can capture the world's attention, but without a mechanism to capture political power, the system simply resets.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Did they actually target the wrong enemy? How do you mean? The great irony of Occupy is that they camped out in Zuccotti Park to protest Wall Street bankers. But Wall Street bankers don't actually write the laws.
The politicians in Washington, D.C., the regulators, the Congress members, they are the ones who wrote the bailout legislation and stripped away the financial regulations in the 1990s.
Exactly. By abandoning mainstream political reform and focusing purely on the cultural symbol of Wall Street, didn't Occupy fundamentally fail to address the root of the problem.
That is a debate that political scientists continue to analyze fiercely. And to be clear to you listening, we are examining this from a sociological perspective.
Right. Impartially reporting what the sources say, not endorsing a specific political strategy or taking a side.
Exactly. However, sociologically speaking, targeting Wall Street was a stroke of narrative genius. It gave the movement and the world the slogan, "We are the 99%."
It is arguably one of the most effective pieces of political branding of the century.
It instantly took this incredibly dense, boring macroeconomic reality derivatives, marginal tax rates, wealth concentration, and distilled it into a perfectly relatable, emotionally charged concept.
You are either the 1% benefiting from the rigged system, or you are the 99% paying for it.
And that is why, even though Occupy didn't successfully pass a slate of laws, it undeniably shifted the Overton window.
The Overton window is a political science concept describing the range of ideas tolerated in public discourse, right?
Yes. Before Occupy, heavily criticizing massive wealth inequality was largely considered fringe or radical in mainstream Western politics. Occupy dragged it squarely into the center.
It changed the political vocabulary. Today, you can turn on the news and hear politicians from entirely opposite ends of the political spectrum constantly professing their deep commitment to Main Street over Wall Street.
Occupy made the reality of massive wealth disparity a central, unavoidable, and permanent topic in modern political elections.
They didn't seize power, but they successfully rewired how the public talks about power. So in the West, we see leaderless movements struggling to enact direct policy, but succeeding in changing the cultural conversation. However, during that exact same time frame, across the Middle East and North Africa, massive leaderless citizen movements were doing a lot more than just changing the conversation.
They were literally tearing down decades-old dictatorships.
But the aftermath proved to be devastatingly complex and tragic. This brings us to the Arab Spring.
The Arab Spring is perhaps the most profound illustration of how rapid technology-enabled citizen mobilization can completely upend the geopolitical order.
While also exposing the terrifying dangers of a power vacuum.
It began in late 2010 in the North African nation of Tunisia.
The root causes here are a potent, highly volatile mix of economic despair and political suffocation.
You have populations across the region that have been ruled for decades by corrupt, entrenched authoritarian regimes.
But critically, you also had a massive demographic shift. The source material highlights the youth bulge.
You have these fast-growing populations with millions of young, often college-educated people entering a stagnant economy that offers absolutely no jobs, no welfare, and no hope for social mobility.
It was a demographic time bomb waiting for a spark.
And that spark was Mohamed Bouazizi. He was a 26-year-old Tunisian street vendor.
He wasn't a political activist or an intellectual dissident, right?
No, he was just a young man trying to support his family by selling fruit from a cart. The local police continually harassed him, confiscated his scales, and demanded bribes he couldn't pay.
In December 2010, after being publicly humiliated and stripped of his sole means of making a living, and after the local governor's office refused to even hear his complaint,
Bouazizi stood in traffic outside the municipal building, poured paint thinner over himself, and set himself on fire.
it is a horrific, absolute tragedy.
And that single act of unimaginable despair resonated with millions of people who felt the exact same daily humiliation and economic strangulation by the state.
His death ignited a powder keg. Protests immediately swept through rural Tunisia and quickly converged on the capital.
Within a matter of weeks, the sheer ferocity and scale of the public outrage forced the longtime dictator, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, to flee the country.
And this is where the communications revolution we discussed earlier shifted into overdrive.
Historically, a regime might have been able to contain the news of a localized uprising.
But in 2010 and 2011, the imagery of the Tunisian protests, the tactics used against the police, and the ultimate success of toppling the dictator spread instantaneously across the region via platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and the pan-Arab news network Al Jazeera.
The psychological barrier of fear was completely shattered.
Citizens in neighboring countries watched the Tunisian regime fall and realized, we can do this too. It triggered a regional earthquake.
The protests spread rapidly. They hit Libya, where the dictator Muammar Gaddafi responded with extreme military violence against his own people,
which eventually led to his ousting and death, following an intervention and bombing campaign by NATO forces.
The unrest swept into Yemen, Bahrain, Algeria, Morocco, and most visibly, Egypt.
But the other side of that coin, and what is most critical to understand from the source material regarding the Arab Spring, is that this was not a uniform fairy tale march toward liberal democracy.
Not at all. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see the outcomes in these different nations were incredibly divergent and in many cases deeply tragic. And again, as we look at this, we're just conveying the sociological dynamics presented in the source material.
Right. Egypt serves as the perfect, complex case study of this roller coaster.
It starts with incredibly inspiring scenes. Millions of citizens occupying Tahrir Square in Cairo, demanding the end of President Hosni Mubarak's 30-year authoritarian rule.
And against all odds, they succeed. Mubarak is forced to resign in early 2011.
The people won, the dictator is gone, but then what?
Because I look at this and realize the terrifying reality of a leaderless movement. They were entirely unified in what they wanted to destroy the Mubarak regime, but because they had no centralized leadership, no political party apparatus, they had absolutely no consensus on what to build in its place.
You have perfectly identified the fatal flaw. Tearing down a building is fundamentally different from designing and constructing a new one.
When Mubarak fell, it created a massive power vacuum.
Initially, the struggle was framed broadly between the pro-democracy activists in the square and the remnants of the old regime, specifically the military apparatus.
But that quickly morphed into a fierce, deeply polarizing ideological contest.
Because when the time came to actually hold democratic elections, the secular liberal activists who had driven much of the initial protests didn't have the organizational infrastructure to win a national campaign.
The group that did have that infrastructure was the Muslim Brotherhood.
They were a well-organized Islamist group with decades of experience operating underground social networks and charities.
In the subsequent elections, their candidate, Mohamed Morsi, won the presidency. It was a democratic election, but the result immediately deeply polarized the country.
Because the secularists, the religious minorities, and the original activists felt that Morsi was aggressively pushing an extreme Islamist agenda.
Drafting a new constitution that favored his ideology and actively consolidating authoritarian power for himself.
So, in a dizzying turn of events, just 2 years after overthrowing Mubarak, millions of Egyptians went back into the streets to massively protest the very government they had just democratically elected.
Which provided the perfect pretext for the most organized institution in the country to reassert control.
In 2013, the Egyptian military, led by General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, stepped in.
They cited the massive public unrest and forcibly ousted the elected President Morsi in a coup.
Sisi then initiated a brutal crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood, outlawing the group and imprisoning its members, and was subsequently elected president himself in 2014.
So we trace the arc of Egypt, from a decades-long military-backed dictatorship to a euphoric democratic citizen uprising, to a deeply polarized and contested elected government, right back to a military-backed authoritarian regime under Sisi.
The system effectively absorbed the shock and reset itself.
But as chaotic and disappointing as the Egyptian transition was for democracy advocates, it absolutely pales in comparison to the utter catastrophic nightmare of Syria.
Syria represents the absolute extreme edge of what happens when popular citizen-led uprisings intersect with the cold, calculating machinery of global geopolitics.
In early 2011, inspired by Tunisia and Egypt, peaceful protests erupted in Syria demanding democratic reforms and the release of political prisoners from Bashar al-Assad's regime.
But Assad had watched Mubarak fall, he had watched Ben Ali flee, he chose a different path.
He chose absolute, unyielding military violence against unarmed protesters.
The regime opened fire on crowds, they utilized tanks in residential neighborhoods, they engaged in mass arrests and torture.
Because Assad refused to yield an inch of power, the peaceful protesters and defecting military officers eventually took up arms to defend themselves.
What began as a citizen demand for dignity rapidly spiraled into a deeply polarizing, multi-sided civil war. And critically, it did not remain a domestic conflict for long.
This is where the international relations aspect becomes truly terrifying. The chaos and the power vacuum in Syria essentially sent out an engraved invitation to every major power in the region and the globe.
It transformed into a deeply sectarian proxy war. Regional rivals poured money and weapons into the country to secure their own strategic interests.
Iran heavily backed the Assad regime to maintain its regional influence, while Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states funded various Sunni rebel factions.
And then the global superpowers entered the arena. Russia stepped in with massive air support to defend Assad and secure their naval access in the Mediterranean.
While the United States and its allies began backing specific opposition forces and eventually Kurdish groups, primarily to counter the rise of extremist groups like ISIS that had thrived in the chaos.
The initial voice of the people demanding democratic reform was completely, utterly drowned out by the artillery of international proxy warfare.
The human cost is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian civilians dead,
Millions internally displaced, and millions more forced to flee the country entirely.
triggering a massive, destabilizing global refugee crisis that fundamentally altered the politics of Europe and the Middle East.
Devastating.
Which forces me to ask a really difficult, cynical question about everything we've discussed today.
What is it?
When the voice of the people successfully removes or severely weakens an entrenched dictator, but fails to immediately establish a strong, unified governing coalition, leaving a massive power vacuum, does a citizen uprising inevitably just invite proxy wars from larger predatory global powers looking to fill that void?
It is the most sobering reality of modern international relations. A localized uprising, however pure its intentions, inherently creates a massive geopolitical vulnerability.
In a world defined by competing state interests and the struggle for resources and strategic advantage, external powers will always seek to exploit a vacuum.
The tragedy of Syria proves that while citizens possess the immense power to tear down a regime, the failure to quickly consolidate legitimate, functioning power simply hands the fate of the nation over to foreign capitals.
So as we pull all of these threads together, what does this actually mean for how the world works today? We have traveled a massive distance in this deep dive.
They really have.
We started with the unbridled optimism of the post-Cold War era, where the assumption was that international cooperation and quiet diplomacy were the new permanent norm.
And we've crashed into the incredibly stark, messy, and often tragic realities of the color revolutions, Occupy Wall Street, the Umbrella Movement, and the Arab Spring.
I believe it means we must permanently discard the romanticized 18th century idea of revolution.
The notion that a popular uprising will look like the French Revolution or the American Revolution, resulting in a clean, definitive regime change, and the immediate drafting of a democratic constitution is incredibly rare in the hyper-connected modern era.
The political systems are far too deeply entrenched. The global economic interdependencies are far too complex, and the external geopolitical pressures are far too immediate.
But at the same exact time, the source material undeniably proves that globalization has permanently linked us.
Our shared ideas, our deep economic grievances, our political demands, they now cross borders at the speed of light.
The citizens of the world are no longer waiting patiently for diplomats in tailored suits to solve their systemic problems.
They are taking to the streets, they are occupying financial districts, they are turning off the economies of their nations, and they are violently forcing the global community to watch and react.
And that is exactly why this history matters deeply to you, the person listening right now.
Every single time you witness a mass protest live streamed on your social media feed, or you participate in a heated public debate online, or you choose to amplify a specific political grievance, you are not just a passive observer.
You are actively participating in a newly evolved, instantaneous form of international relations.
You are bypassing the traditional mahogany tables of formal diplomacy and plugging directly into the global political nervous system.
It is a staggering, almost overwhelming amount of power held in the palm of our hands.
But as we wrap up, it leaves us with a final, lingering, and frankly provocative thought to mull over. Technology has undeniably empowered the people.
It has allowed citizens to organize, communicate, and mobilize faster, cheaper, and more effectively than at any prior point in human history.
But we must remember the lesson of anti-color insurance. That exact same technology heavily empowers the state.
It allows authoritarian governments and even democratic ones to surveil their populations in real time, to track dissenting voices through their smartphones, to utilize facial recognition in public squares, and to implement countermeasures faster and more ruthlessly than ever before.
So the fundamental question you have to ask yourself as you watch the next waves of global movements unfold is this: who ultimately wins the arms race of the globalized voice?
Is it the citizens, armed with smartphones, shared anger, and umbrellas?
Or is it the state, armed with algorithmic surveillance, endless resources, and riot gear? The massive, entrenched foundations of global politics are visibly shaking, and for better or worse, we are all holding the hammer. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.